This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today I'm continuing with my War of the Spark limited review by looking at blue. We looked at white yesterday. I use a letter grade system in my videos. If you want to know what those grades mean, follow a link in the description below to see a video that explains all that. Now, let's start with our first blue card, which is Ashiok's Skulker, which was actually one of my preview cards. Ashiok's Skulker costs 4 generic and a blue. It's a 3/5 Nightmare common, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to make it so it can be blocked this turn. Ashiok's Nightmare Friend looks pretty solid to me. The stats aren't the prettiest, and the activated ability is a bit high, but I think being unblockable will be better in this format than in most. I mean, an effect like that is always good because it means it has late game viability, a place to spend your mana if you're getting mana screwed, but being able to go after planeswalkers, even against opponents with developed boards, seems pretty nice. I can see being alright with having one of these in all my blue decks, but I don't think you really want to have more than one, and I don't think you need to take it highly or anything like that. I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Augur of Bolas, which is a reprint, and for 1 generic and a blue, it is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, and you may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put it into your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This is a reprint that is pretty good and constructed, but it's way harder to make work in limited. To get a hit consistently on your top 3 cards, you need way more instants and sorceries than most decks are going to have, which is like 4 or 5. Now, it isn't like the fail case for this card is abysmal, since it is still a 2-mana 1/3, and if you can get the card out of it like 50% of the time, it's probably still worth playing. I think it is a build around, maybe a C in your typical deck, and a B- if your deck has 7 or more instants and sorceries, and you can consistently draw the card off of it. This Enter the Battlefield trigger is just super powerful in a world where you can actually consistently draw a card off of it, but if you can't, it's not anything exciting. Next up, we have Naga Eternal, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 zombie bird warrior at common. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you amass 1. This is a really good common. Windrake is usually like a C or C-, but this is a Windrake that either puts a +1/+1 counter on an army or gives you a 1/1 army. Either way, you are really getting your mana's worth here. We have seen 3 mana 2/2s that make 1/1s be very high quality commons in the past, and I don't think that this changes here, even if you won't always get an army. You will always get some value. A 3 mana 2/2 flyer that puts a counter on a creature would be a good common too, and it's going to be one of those, and either of those would be a pretty great common. This is a great card as is, the kind of common you can first pick, and that you'd play like 5 copies of if you could. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Bond of Insight, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, return up to 2 instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Bond of Insight. I don't think this is playable in an average deck in this format. This is because you will need a decent number of instants and sorceries for this card to actually do anything. And just like Augur of Bolas, it is going to fit into the blue-red deck the best probably. That's the one that has the most spell payoffs, including Bond of Insight and Augur of Bolas. Milling yourself and your opponent 4 cards just isn't going to be worth it if you aren't also returning 2 instants or sorceries. Even just returning 1 is a pretty bad deal for 4 mana. As a result, I'm giving this an F as a main board card, but a C+ in a deck with a lot of spells, which basically means the blue-red deck. Next up is Callous Dismissal, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common sorcery, and it says, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, amass 1. I'm always a fan of disperse effects, and this is a nice version of one. It may be sorcery speed, but I think giving you a 1/1 out of the deal, or a +1/+1 counter out of the deal, does mitigate against that a little bit. But it's still a card that lets you interact with your opponent, and sure, you can't blow them out on combat tricks or anything like that, because it's sorcery speed, but you can still get a lot of value out of a card like this, because another nice thing about it is most disperse effects don't actually develop your side of the board at all, and when you cast this, it's almost like a 2 mana 1/1 that returns a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Think about that, because that would be a pretty good card. Obviously, it's not quite that good, but, the way all of these amass cards work, otherwise it can also be a 2 mana return something and put a +1/+1 counter on something. Again, that would be a pretty good playable, a pretty good common. And I think, both sides that you can get out of this are going to be pretty solid. You interact with your opponent's board, you get to add something to your board, and that's pretty nice. I don't quite think it's first pickable, but I do think it's pretty good. I think it's a high quality common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Commence the Endgame, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, can't be countered, and it says draw 2 cards, then amass X, where X is the number of cards in your hand. This is an interesting card to evaluate. Obviously, 6 mana, draw 2, and add 2 power to the board isn't like a bomb, but I think that would probably be something like a C+ on its own. And especially at instant speed, this can give you a 3-for-1 because, you can make a larger army or a 2-2 and then use it to trade with your opponent, then whatever number of cards you draw. And that's a pretty good deal, even when you're only able to draw 2. If you get to do more than draw 2, obviously it gets better and better. In the end, I do think it's a little bit expensive and clunky, but I can't imagine not wanting to play one of these in a blue deck in this format, and I think it is first pickable. I think it's a solid B. Next up, we have Contentious Plan, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common sorcery with Proliferate, and it says draw a card. Remember, Proliferate is the mechanic where you can decide to add a counter to anything that already has a counter in play. I don't think this is worth playing in most decks. 2 mana to draw a card is pretty mediocre. It's like cycling. And yeah, adding Proliferate to it does make a difference, and there are lots of counters lying around in this set, but I think you need the Proliferate on this to do something a really significant percentage of the time, like, 70% of the time before you want to be playing this. Just having 2 cards with counters isn't enough. In your deck, that is. If you have 2 creatures in play with counters, then Contentious Plan will feel pretty good. Now, another possibility is that your deck has 2 to 3 things with counters and 2 to 3 spell payoffs, in which case it's probably still playable because it helps you get synergy for either one. However, I still see it as a card that you would cut in a heartbeat for a more meaningful spell, meaning that it is a 23rd card type of card that you're not happy to have in your deck, but sometimes you have to play it, and for me, that's a D. Next up, we have Crush Descent, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 generic mana, amass 2. This doesn't look that good to me. I'm already not very high on counter spells that aren't hard counters because their value diminishes into the late game, but if they're cheaper, like Quench and Ravnica Allegiance, then you can at least play it relatively early, and leaving the mana up for it later isn't as much of an issue. In the case of this, you can play around it pretty easily. If your opponent has to leave a whopping 4 mana up to do this, and you play a 2 or 3 drop with the mana available to pay for this, if they counter it, they're going to be in serious trouble. This costs double what Quench does, and the opponent can still pay 2 mana to undo it. Adding a mass to it does make it a little better than the F it would be if it were just 4 mana counter target spell, unless its controller pays 2. But I still don't think it's an especially good card. I think it's just a D. Next up, we have Erratic Visionary, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 human wizard at common. He's a 1/3, and for 1 generic and a blue, you can tap him to loot. Draw a card, then discard a card. If you know me, you know I love to loot, and this does it. It comes with uninspiring but passable stats as a 2 mana 1/3, and sure, I'd rather loot for less than 2 mana, but I'm okay with this. This is a kind of card that has value early as a defensive creature, maybe even does a damage or 2, and then late in the game, it can actually help you win because it gives you such great card selection in the late game. Your opponent and you are both in top deck mode. If you have a Visionary in play, you're probably going to win that game because you're going to be able to rip through your deck and find whatever it is and avoid drawing lands as much as you can and so forth. I think it's a nice common for blue. I think it's a C+. Next up we have Eternal Skylord, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/3 zombie wizard at uncommon, and it says whenever it enters a battlefield amass 2, and zombie tokens you control have flying. I like this card a lot. He is probably the best creature, at least at common or uncommon with amass in the set. So you pay 5 mana here to always get 5/5 worth of stats. Good deal. But 2/2 of that will have flying. If you already have an army in play, it getting flying in +2/+2 right away is great. You can play this and have it be great in a deck with 0 other ways to make armies too, because it is just so efficient on its own. Because of all that, this seems like one of the best uncommons in the set. I'm going to give it a B, which means I will be happy to first pick it. Next up, we have Fibblethip the Lost, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 legendary homunculus at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. If it entered from your library or it was cast from your library, draw 2 cards instead. When Fibblethip becomes the target of a spell, you shuffle it into its owner's library. So this is kind of an interesting card. I think at its core, it's just an Elvish Visionary with a little bit of other stuff going on, some of which is an upside, some of which is a downside. And Elvish Visionary is always like a C in Limited. 2 mana 1/1s who draw you a card are nice value, and sometimes can even get you a 2-for-1. That's probably what will happen here most of the time. However, you can use effects like Vivian's Arcbow to put it into play and draw more cards. You can also shuffle it back into your library if you want by targeting him with a spell, but I don't think that comes up a whole lot. Sometimes your opponent will get an advantage out of that effect too, because if Fibblethip, for example, is your only blocker and they have lethal if they get him out of the way, they will have even more cards than usual that can just get rid of Fibblethip, like combat tricks. But in short, there are not enough ways to get Fibblethip into play and draw 2 cards in the set. It's just an Elvish Visionary, and that means he's a C. Next up, we have Finale of Revelation, which for X and 2 blue is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says draw X cards. If X is 10 or more, instead shuffle your graveyard into your library. Draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. Exile Finale of Revelation. Like all Finale cards, this is pretty good, though maybe not a straight A like some of its fellow cards in this cycle. It is still not a bad card or anything, but the efficiency here doesn't get interesting until X is at like 3. I mean, paying 5 to draw 3 is solid, and if that's all this was, it would probably be a C+. And yeah, if X equals 10, you're going to win thanks to insane card advantage. And obviously once X is 4 or more, I think the card starts to give you a pretty incredible rate. So it is still great, and first pickable, it's just not incredible. I'm giving it a B. Next up is Flux Channeler, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human wizard and uncommon, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. So Flux Channeler, pretty good. A 3 mana 2/2 isn't the greatest stats, but if you have enough non-creature spells in your deck and enough +1/+1 counters, a combination that will be pretty nice, then Flux Channeler will get to be kind of silly because it has, a trigger that happens every time you play instant sorcery, planeswalker, etc. And proliferating repeatedly is a very powerful effect if you can take advantage of it. That said, I think in a lot of blue decks in this format, it's probably just a D because you have to have, again, a pretty specific mix of +1/+1 counter things and instants and sorceries. I do think if you get there, it's a pretty good card, though. I think it's a C+. Next up, we have God Eternal Kefnet, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 4/5 legendary zombie god at Mythic Rare. It has flying, and it says you may reveal the first card you draw each turn as you draw it. Whenever you reveal an instant or sorcery card this way, copy that card and you may cast the copy. That copy costs 2 less to cast. And then it has the God Clause everything in this cycle has. When it dies or is exiled, you can put it into your deck 3 cards from the top. So a 4 mana 4/5 with flying is already a B, and the card advantage this generates for you on top of that is stupid. However, unlike the other gods, Kefnet is more of a build around. Only copying instants and sorceries means in a lot of decks, all Kefnet will be is a 4 mana 4/5 flyer that is difficult to make stay dead, which is really good, but I don't think it quite reaches A level. I mean, I think if you get 1 copied spell out of Kefnet, you'll feel pretty good, and I could maybe say that Kefnet is a B in most decks in this format, and an A in a deck with enough instants and sorceries, which is pretty great. But it will be a B in some decks, but obviously, this thing has a really powerful floor and ceiling, so you're not going to not want to first pick it, or even pick it up like late, because let's say you're in a blue deck of some sort and you're in the last pack, and you look down at your deck and you have like 4 instants and sorceries. There's still not much you should take over God Eternal Kefnet in that situation, because it's still an amazing creature, even if you take all of that away. Next we have Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which for 1 generic and 3 blue is a legendary planeswalker Jace at rare, and his static ability, remember all planeswalkers in this set have them, his says if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. He has a +1 that says target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card, and a -8 that says draw 7 cards, and if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. And you start with 4 loyalty. This Jace isn't a bomb at all, at least for limited. Sure, the idea of winning the game Laboratory Maniac style is kind of cool, and obviously his +1 synergizes with that. If you're targeting yourself with it, you're taking out 3 cards a turn. But he doesn't have any good way to protect himself, and he has a static ability that doesn't affect the board in any meaningful way. If you already have a good board state, he's going to draw you a bunch of cards and you'll win with him, so he isn't bad. He just isn't really a way of gaining advantage all on his own. In a lot of ways, I think he is a hard-to-cast divination, which means he's a C. Next up, we have Jace's Triumph, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says draw 2 cards. If you control a Jace Planeswalker, draw 3. So at the base level, Jace's Triumph is Divination. And I think in this format, which looks on the slower side for the most part, Divination is probably a pretty solid card, like a C. This does have some additional upside, but as we just saw, the only Jace Planeswalker in the set is rare, so getting to draw 3 off of it won't happen too often, though when it does, you will feel pretty great. So yeah, there's upside, but don't be surprised if it never happens and you never witness somebody casting Jace's Triumph and getting the extra value out of it, even if you draft this set 60 plus times. That's why I'm just going to give it a C. It's a 2-for-1 all on its own, and there is a spell deck in this format, so it seems solid. Next up, we have Kasmina, Enigmatic Mentor, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon legendary planeswalker with the Kasmina subtype. Her static ability says, spells your opponents cast that target a creature or planeswalker you control cost 2 more to cast. And then for -2 loyalty, she creates a 2/2 blue wizard creature token, draw a card, then discard a card, and she starts with 5 loyalty. I think this is one of the better uncommon walkers in the set. 4 mana for a 2/2 that loots would already be kind of a passable card, like maybe a D+. And that's kind of like what this card is in a worst case scenario. The most of the time it's going to do something else as well. I think getting 2 2/2s and looting twice is a great deal for 4 mana, and adding the static ability is an extra bonus. It's a static ability that won't always come up, but it probably will a significant percentage of the time. People run removal, right? I think Kasmina is pretty great, and I'm going to give her a B. I think you first pick her in a lot of packs. Next up, we have Kasmina's Transmutation, which for 1 generic and a blue is an aura at common with enchant creature, and it says, enchanted creature loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 1/1. This is about as close as blue gets to something that's premium removal, and it's a common here, so that's nice. Sure, it doesn't straight up get rid of the creature because your opponent will get to block with the 1/1, but it does essentially blank the creature, taking away all abilities. In some cases, this is better than pacifism effects because those effects don't turn off powerful activated or static abilities in most cases. I do think we have to temper our expectations a little bit because this set is loaded up with plus and +1 counters, and if you put the transmutation on it, yeah, it'll shrink the creature, but if there's like 4 counters, transmutation is not going to feel too good there, against zombie armies and the like. Additionally, there are lots of ways to sacrifice and bounce creatures in this format that do make it worse because your opponent can then just use the creatures as a resource anyway. But I think this still looks pretty good, and to start the format, I think you can first pick it in weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Kiora's Dam Breaker, which for 5 generic and a blue is a 5/6 Leviathan at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you proliferate. A 6 mana 5/6 isn't great, but it is passable, especially in blue. It would probably be like a C-. Add Proliferate to that, and it certainly gets better, especially in a set whose cup runneth over with various types of counters. I think this is a solid C. Next up, we have Lazotep Plating, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant with a -1, and it says, you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. There are a few cards in this set that seem to have been printed with the intent of taking away the downside a mass has. That is, that you can put a ton of resources into one of those tokens and have it get bounced or destroyed, and really not feel so good about the situation. Overall, I think this is actually a pretty solid card. Sometimes we see these hexproof effects, and they are hard to want to actually play because they're situational, but since this one comes with a mass, it does more than just blank a removal spell. I also think the special synergy with the mass still makes this pretty solid. Still, it is situational. Against some opponents, it won't really matter, but hey, at least you can amass one in those matches if you just have to. I don't think I would ever want more than one of these, but I would feel fine playing the first. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Naga Eternal, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 zombie Naga at common. So here's our obligatory blue creature in the uninspiring vanilla creature cycle. You'll play this if you're desperate, but most of the time you're going to hope that you don't have to play it. That makes it a D. Next up, we have Narset, Parter of Veils, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a legendary planeswalker with the Narset subtype. It's an uncommon, and it says each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. That's a static ability. It has 5 loyalty, and it has a -2 loyalty ability that says, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So her static ability isn't going to come up a ton, though, it might a couple times across the life of this format. So what we're really judging here is her -2 ability, which can effectively draw you an extra card 2 turns in a row. Well, effectively is a strong word, because for it to do that, your deck is going to need to have the right composition. Most decks will have 15-ish creatures and 17-ish lands, making up 32 cards in your deck. And lots of decks will have more creatures than that. Generally, you probably need to be close to 6 or 8 non-creature spells to consistently hit with her -2, and ideally you get a hit off of it both times you can use it. Obviously, even using it twice is far from guaranteed too. Basically, I think Narset is probably a D in your typical limited deck in the format, but it can probably get to a C in a deck with a lot of spells. Next up, we have Narset's Reversal, which for 2 blue mana is a rare instant, and it says, copy target instant or sorcery spell, then return it to its owner's hand. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is a weird card. Using this on your opponent is going to be best, obviously. If you do, your opponent's spell doesn't resolve, but you get to cast it basically before they do. It gets returned to their hand, so they're going to get to do it eventually. So in a lot of ways, this is a tempo spell that lets you cast the spell first, and maybe for a lot less mana than your opponent if they're spending 5 or 6 for the card. This will be especially devastating if your opponent is casting an expensive spell, but it seems to me that doing this on just about any removal spell is going to feel pretty good. It's basically a fork effect, except that your opponent has to cast the spell again later, and I think that's alright. Grading this is a challenge because how good it is may depend on how exactly spells line up in this format. There will be some opponents who have 2 to 4 spells this can target, in which case it will feel pretty awful and be stuck in your hand. Just because lining it up at the right time will be more of a challenge than it is usually. But I think against most people, you'll get to use this pretty effectively in most games. I don't think it is utterly game-breaking or anything, especially because of how situational it is, but I think it's a C+. Next, we have No Escape, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant that says, counter target creature or planeswalker spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. Scry 1. I've been wrong on counter spells in both of the last 2 sets, where 3 mana counter spells have been pretty solid, and I think this one will be solid too. 3 mana to counter creatures or planeswalkers isn't great, but the fact that it's 1 blue does make it a little better. Having the exile clause actually matters sometimes too. What really fully sells me on this being a solid playable for blue, though, is the addition of Scry 1. I love me some Scry, and being able to say no to your opponent's spell, and keep in mind being able to counter a creature or planeswalker probably amounts to like 80% of the spells in your opponent's deck, but saying no to your opponent and smoothing out your next draw seems pretty sweet to me. Still, it is a counterspell and it's not like a hyper impressive one, but it's a solid playable. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Relentless Advance, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common sorcery with a mass 3. I don't think this is good. You have 2 possibilities here. One is that you just paid 4 to put 3 +1/+1 counters onto a zombie army token you already have, and the other is that you paid 4 mana for a 3/3, in other words, a hill giant. Sure, it has some synergy with Proliferate and other cards with a mass, but neither of those deals would be particularly attractive and limited. I think this is a D. You'll play it when you have to, like most hill giants, but I don't think you want to be doing it. Next, we have Rescuer Sphinx, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/2 Sphinx at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return a non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Rescuer Sphinx enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So a 4 mana 3/2 with flying is always alright in formats, C- or a C. However, the Sphinx comes with a decent amount of upside. Like in most sets, returning one of your permanents to your hand can give you some value, either by making an aura-based removal spell fall off, or by taking advantage of an enter the battlefield ability. In this set, you can also add planeswalkers to this list, who you can bounce when they are low on loyalty. Plus, the Sphinx gets a +1/+1 counter out of the deal if it does that. Even though this will be a 4 mana 3/2 with flying a decent chunk of the time, the amount of upside it has allows it to jump into the lower B range, and I think I would feel alright about first picking this, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Silent Submersible, which for 2 blue mana is a 2/3 artifact vehicle at rare, and when it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you get to draw a card. It has crew 2. So this is like a super fixed version of a Smuggler's Copter. You can tell they were worried about making this too good because of how underwhelming it is. First, it costs 2 colored mana, meaning it is not easy to play in a deck like the Copter was. Second, it's only a 2/3. Third, it has crew 2. And fourth, it has no evasion of any kind. I think all of that combined makes this just solid filler. With vehicles, you usually want a good rate on them since you have to crew them, but you're not really getting that here. It is true that if you manage to draw a card with this, even just 1 card, you're going to feel pretty good, and doing so isn't impossible. If your opponent has a slow start and you have some bounce spells, they'll be in a world of hurt, but it is hard to imagine this really getting in during the mid or late game. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Sky Theater Strix, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 bird at common. It has flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Well, I'm happy they managed to print a bird that is sort of solid in the blue-red spells deck, since that tends to be my favorite archetype. So despite all the Stormcrow memes out there, a 2-mana 1/2 flyer is not good, probably like a D-. However, in a deck that can consistently pump this thing's power, it becomes decent as a 2-drop, but probably really only moves up to a C-. You're still going to cut it a significant portion of the time in that deck. It isn't exactly a card that is like a huge for the blue-red deck. It's just one that kind of fits into it, but it's never going to be like the card you're excited about synergy-wise in your blue-red spells deck. Next up, we have Spark Double, which for 3 generic and a blue is an illusion at rare. It's a 0/0, and you may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature, and with an additional loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker. And it isn't legendary if that permanent is legendary. This is pretty good. While not quite a clone, since it can't copy your opponent's creatures and only your own, this is still a really good card. Sure, if your board is empty, it is useless, and that does matter, but most of the time you'll be able to copy your best creature or planeswalker and actually have it come into play a little bit better as a result of the counter it adds to itself. It isn't hard to get your 4 mana's worth out of this. The additional counters make it pretty easy. It gets especially nice with cards with enter the battlefield abilities. Anyway, I think this card is really good. I think it's one you're happy to first pick. I think it is a B+. Next up is Spellkeeper Weird, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 weird at common. You can pay 2 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. A 3-mana 1/4 has some not entirely horrendous defensive stats, and this one comes with the ability to get back key spells, with removal spells being the most interesting. While I think this will probably be best in a blue-red spells deck, I think most blue decks in this format will probably run, 4 or 5 instants of sorceries at least, and because this is just sort of like a decent creature until you have an instant or sorcery to get back, I think it's a solid playable in any blue deck in the format. I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Stealth Mission, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common sorcery. It says put 2 counters on target creature you control, +1/+1 counters that is. That creature can't be blocked this turn. I don't normally like cards like this. The payoff isn't worth the risk most of the time. Sure, you get a free swing in, and sometimes it will win you the game, but a lot of the time, it just doesn't matter. And it is super risky because it opens you up to a dreaded 2-for-1 in many situations if you aren't careful. All that said, there is a common creature with hexproof in this set, so I think in conjunction with that, plus some +1/+1 counter synergies, that's probably when the card can be at its best. But I think in most decks in the format, it's just a D. Next up is Timmy O'S Epiphany, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common sorcery. It says scry 4, then draw 2 cards. 4 mana to potentially see 6 cards in your deck is a good deal, even at sorcery speed. This gives you some insane card selection to go along with the card advantage it gives you in the form of a 2-for-1, and I like that a lot. If this format is slow, this could end up being really great, but for now I'm going to say that I think I always want 1 to 2 of these in a blue deck, and I think that makes it a C+. If the format's slow enough, it could be as high as a B-, I think. Next up, we have Teferi's Time Twist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says exile target permanent you control. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next instep. If it enters the battlefield as a creature, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So this sort of flicker effect is probably extra good in this format. That's because if you can use this on a planeswalker, you can reset its loyalty. Because this is an instant, if your opponent tries to take down said planeswalker, you can use Time Twist, both saving it and setting your opponent's board back in a way because they just attacked with all their creatures or whatever. On top of that, Teferi's Time Twist is also good with into the battlefield creatures. It can help your creature dodge a removal spell and so on. And the fact it also makes those creatures bigger is nice. I think most blue decks in this format probably have enough things that this is good with for it to be a solid C. Next up, we have Thunder Drake, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/3 elemental drake at common. It has flying, and it says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Thunder Drake. So I think this is kind of a build around. A 4 mana 2/3 with flying is not a great rate, but obviously if you can put a couple of counters on it, even 1 counter, you're doing pretty good with this card. Doing so isn't exactly a walk in the park, though. Casting 2 spells in a turn happens, and maybe most decks will be capable of getting 1 counter on this at least some of the time. But unless you have a really low curve, I don't imagine this being super incredible. Then, if you draw it in the later part of the game, even if your deck has a lot of ways to cast 2 spells in a turn, it's going to be hard to get a counter on it after you play it because you're just in top deck mode, and making it gain a counter isn't going to be easy. I do think this looks like a lot of fun. I'm excited to play with this card, and yeah, it's my kind of build around. I think you need a really low curve to really be in business here, and maybe some card draw spells, because obviously you could draw with the spell and then play something, and that will give you 2 spells. That said, the floor is reasonable. I think the card is a C, and I think it has a ceiling as high as B. If you can make it consistently be at least a 3-4, you're probably in business there. Next up, we have Totally Lost, which for 4 generic and a blue is a common instant that says put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. This is another reprint, and it's always fine. Putting something on top of your opponent's library is better than just bouncing something, because it means you are replacing your opponent's draw, meaning you are trading one card for another. With bounce spells, you don't usually get to do that. You're just getting tempo. Still, at 5 mana, this is a bit clunky, though it can enable some nice blowouts, and you can play it in response to combat tricks. It'll also be pretty good if your opponent's really all in on an amass army, because obviously it just gets rid of it. I think this is a C in every format we've seen it in, and I think it's one here too. All right, now we're on to the last blue card, which is Wall of Runes, which for 1 blue mana is a 0/4 wall at common. It has Defender, and it says when it enters the battlefield, scry 1. 1 mana for a 0/4 is actually a pretty alright deal. It means it can block fairly effectively in the early game, and it also scries, so it is always going to give you some value in addition to just being a chump blocker. That said, these purely defensive types of walls aren't something that most decks will want in this format, or any format really, and I think that makes it hard for this to be more than a D+. You'd just rather be playing something that has a bigger impact, especially from mid-game on. Well, that does it for today's limited review video. I'll be back tomorrow to look at black. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the other limited review videos for War of the Spark, a link to that playlist should be on the screen now. Thanks for watching.